I'm Eleni Giokos. I'm a correspondent at CNN. I'd like to thank Oando PLC as well as the Institute of Directors Nigeria for putting this together. We will also be hearing at the end of our conversation from the Director General and the CEO of the Institute of Directors, Dele Alimi, as closing remarks and just some of the thinking behind talking leadership during times of crisis. As I mentioned, we'd love to hear from you as well. We'll be opening the channels up for questions and answers from our panel. So please jot your thoughts and your questions down as well. So these are indeed unprecedented times. And I said, I'm so used to being on stage and seeing my audience members, but you know, it's still so fantastic that we are able to engage on various platforms. And it just makes me think how fortunate we are. But in this environment, we need strong and bold leadership. And without that, we won't be able to navigate ourselves through these very turbulent waters. What's interesting is that African countries have been some of the last hit with the virus, but it's given leaders an interesting perspective of how to best deal with the pandemic, from lockdowns to shoring up the health sector. African leaders and the private sector are preparing. They're buying time to find solutions to the problem. In the last few weeks, it's incredible. We've seen massive capital outflows out of emerging markets and of course out of Africa as well. The oil price shock has rocked oil producing economies on the continent. Currency volatility is a reality, and the prognosis from a growth perspective for 2020 is really not good. The IMF and the World Bank are talking about the first recession to hit sub-Saharan Africa for the first time in 25 years. Fast-growing economies on the continent and around the world have been brought to their knees. Their inequalities pronounced, health care deficits highlighted, and in Africa, the lifeblood of our economy, the informal sector, what many people around the world call the gig economy, so to speak, might be decimated due to the lockdowns as well. So it's a conundrum. What do? Do you lock down to save lives and buy time, or do you try and protect the economy? So some of the things that we've been doing at CNN, you know, we tell our stories, and we're hearing that governments are saying you've got to embark on social distancing. But in Africa, and a lot of the townships, for example, here in South Africa, people live in tiny rooms of people of 10. So how do you embark on social distancing? We tell people to wash their hands, but clean water, in fact, is a commodity for many people around the continent. And we tell people not to work, and yet they're already living on the poverty line. But the private sector has mobilized, and it's thinking of ways to counter the detrimental impact. So their role is going to be vital, but it's also one about survival and building strong institutions that are going to come out of the storm stronger and more resilient as well. We are going to be focusing on Nigeria, but of course, Pan-African themes as well. I think oil is going to be an important theme to look at because you're drying up revenues, but at the same time, you have institutions, financing institutions saying non-concessional loans are going to be important. Debt relief is going to be important. The African Development Bank has come in and has spoken quite extensively about supporting oil-producing economies. And it's so interesting. I came across a Nigerian proverb many years ago, and it's kind of stuck with me, and I think it's more relevant now than ever before. In times of crisis, the wise build bridges and the foolish build dams. So now is the time to connect and to find ways to help each other to overcome the crisis. I'd like to introduce my panelists today. I've got Dr. Alex Irune, the COO of Oando Energy Resources, Emmanuel Ijewere, agriculturist and accountant, Boye Olusanya, Chief Operating Officer for Flourmills, Nigeria, Ebong, Group Executive, Treasury and Financial Institutions at First Bank, Nkemdilim Uwaje Begho, a 2019 Obama leader and the CEO of FutureSoft, and Solape Hammond, a Special Advisor on Sustainable Development Goals for Lagos State. So great to have you with us. Thank you so much for taking the time. To all our panelists, I'd like to start off by asking you about how your leadership style and strategy has changed since the start of the pandemic and what you're doing in your respective fields. I'm going to let you speak for a couple of minutes and then we'll get into our dialogue. And Alex, I'd like to start off with you. I think it's such an important time for oil and gas companies, but for Nigeria as well. And given the fact that Oando is such a strong player, tell me about some of your experience over the last few weeks, because you're looking at it from a social perspective, but you've also got to look at the business side of things as well.
Of course. Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot, Eleni. It's quite interesting, this new style we're all having to adapt to. I think usually you're in front of an audience, like you said, but typically without the nervousness of your little kid coming in and sort of being the star of the show and taking over. So I'm delighted to be here. You're right. What we've seen has been a confluence of issues. First, of course, the coronavirus pandemic, and then layered on top of that, and all its restrictions, a price war in the middle of that issue. And in truth, what we've seen is 7 weeks of decimation of the oil prices due to an oversupply. We do have, of course, the pent up demand that's sitting indoors and trying to social distance to allow this virus reduce its communication ability. So where has that left us? I mean, 2 days ago, I think we all recall the negative $30 oil sale out of Cushion. We could talk about the technicalities of that and that being a particular trade and an inventory issue, but all the same, the fact is this: we are oversupplied. We certainly are running out of storage, and the world is not consuming as much oil as it should. Where does that leave Oando as an oil producer? Just like the Nigerian government, we rely on oil for our prosperity, for our wealth. And in truth, we are seeing times like we have never seen, at least in my history as a professional. You're at a point where CAPEX cuts and OPEX cuts probably are the first step, but then collaborative engagement, understanding how governments can support private sector, what private sector can do to leverage and multiply what the government is doing. But most importantly, a long-term plan with a view of coming out on the end of this. Let's not look for the short fixes. It might be painful, it might be tough, but I think we all have to look long-term, and the supports have to be geared towards that sort of thinking.
Fantastic, Alex. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to now turn to Solape. You've got a really interesting mandate and focusing on sustainable development goals. And I'm really someone that advocates in reaching, the Agenda 2030. But the realities are that money is drying up. Low-income countries are going to be increasing their debt to deal with the pandemic. But on the other end, you've also got an opportunity to transform, for example, the health sector and to try and alleviate poverty as you try and fight the pandemic. What has happened in your environment and in your world over the last few weeks?
Thank you, Eleni, and very glad to be here. Yes, this was supposed to be the decade of action. And I think we started this year really optimistic, and it's all become quite interesting. It's taken quite a turn. But it's important to still stay focused. The bottom line is we still need to bring people out of poverty. We have to find creative ways to make this happen. It had become clear that no government could achieve the SDGs on their own. The only way, in fact, we couldn't achieve it basically with a business as usual approach. Our budgets are typically, particularly in this part of the world, a tiny fraction of GDP, and what was needed to achieve these goals would typically be multiples of that. So we were already cognizant of that and the fact that we needed to engage the private sector, not just from a CSR perspective where it's a tiny percentage of what they do, but with a complete shift with how we approach everything. And this has really brought it home. The pandemic has brought it home. We have to relook how we're approaching healthcare. We have to relook how we're approaching how we live. We have to relook food security and poverty, because there are great implications for all of us with regards to what's going on. And this is estimated that anywhere from 40 to 50% of people in Lagos are at or below the poverty line. That proportion is likely to rise if nothing is done, because no matter how much we cushion it, there will probably be some impact to jobs as jobs shift out of certain sectors. So it's important that we look at creating jobs, we look at securing that lower level, we look at social transfers to support them, and we have to relook healthcare. We all were aware of healthcare tourism, particularly from Nigeria, and the fact that our healthcare sector basically wasn't good enough to support everyone in this country. That's become even more obvious, and with the fact that most of us cannot travel because there's bans everywhere, we really have to look at that and address that, not just to face the pandemic, but going forward to support our people. So it definitely, what this says to us is it's definitely a year of looking at doing things differently. We're going to have to educate our children differently. We had a high number of out-of-school children. Now every child is out of school, and we have to have structures to be able to address them, particularly those at the lower income that may not have access to online education services. So how do you reach these children in a situation where everything is contagious? So there's a lot of rethinking, there's a lot of creativity that's required, and most importantly, cooperation. Without the cooperation, we're not going to get anywhere. We need the cooperation with the private sector, civil society, international partners to create these solutions, but we also need the cooperation of the populace, because no matter what strategies you adopt, if people do not align with those strategies, if we don't discipline ourselves to follow through, we'll end up not being able to move the needle. So I think for us, it's more about communicating with the people, listening to them. We found it's more important. People are valuing, it seems, the level of communication that's coming out, and we're really happy that we're now able to reach people. Because one of the things that surprised me when I got into government was just how hard it is to communicate. You feel you're really communicating and you're repeating yourself, but people don't hear your messages. But that's been getting a lot better since the start of this pandemic. And I think particularly with Governor Sanwo-Olu's constant communication, people have really appreciated that. But one of the things I'm finding has really helped us is listening to people, because when you listen, you can co-create those solutions, and they're it's more easily adopted, and more people are out there trying to work with you to make them happen.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Solape. Eni, I'd like to get your sense right now of the situation. As a financial institution, you guys are going to be playing a really important role down the line, purely because you play a role in terms of the social impact, and banking, the unbanked, helping businesses, the corporate side of things. I mean, you're across quite a large value chain. How have things changed within First Bank, and how are you guys adapting your business right now?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I think, our core role is financial intermediation, right? And we really are a service industry. And I think when you look at what has happened now with the impact of COVID and social distancing, the lockdowns and all of that, it just amplifies when you look at the core mega trends that have happened across financial services and the whole shift towards a traditional face-to-face physical interaction towards moving towards the digital and operating financial services using channels, that has just become center plate. I mean, in the last 4 to 5 years, First Bank has invested massively in that area. We've rolled out a whole suite of digital channels to reach, as you mentioned, the bottom of the pyramid, the unbanked, to drive financial inclusion. We've rolled out an agent banking network where we have over 50,000 agents spread across literally every local government in the country. And today, where we have 70% of our branch network effectively closed or operating extremely limited services, we find that it's those digital channels, that agent network, that is sustaining financial intermediation and activity across the country. So back at the bank, we've debated that had this happened 5 years ago, would we have been in a position to respond and to continue sustaining these financial services at the scale at which we're able to operate today? And the answer was probably not. So clearly it has changed, and it's certainly going to be a key driver for future financial inclusion and growth, and more importantly, intermediation into the future. Because whether we like it or not, post this immediate crisis, which is post immediate lockdown, I don't think it will be business as usual a long time to come. Some of the new norms in doing business, some of the new norms in engaging that are emerging now will persist for quite a while until we finally lick this disease. So those platforms will be key drivers for the future to drive that development.
Fantastic. Mr. Ijewere, you've seen many different cycles. Have you seen anything like this before? And how are you engaging in finding solutions? If you could just unmute your mic. There we go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Good morning, sir.
Yeah, we have to get used to this new technology, you know. I'm
Yes,
used to face-to-face
oh,
discussions.
by the way.
Now, thank you very much for having me. Good morning to all of you, and please stay safe. I would rather, from the agricultural perspective, I will put it this way. It's like a family, the parents telling a child, keep away from fire.
Yeah.
Keep away from fire because fire is dangerous. And the child doesn't until they take the child's hand and put it over a candle lit. And he suffers the burn. When that burn takes place, from that moment on, that child has a completely different perspective to what fire is and remembers what the parents have been saying. The world and the economic community in Nigeria have kept on telling Nigeria, your strength is in agriculture. Everybody has said it. Everybody has paid lip service to it. Our future is not oil. Our future is agriculture. But we never did. And I think, I hate to say this, but coronavirus, this pandemic, seemed to have put our hands on the fire. Having done that, it's a question now, what new perspectives do we have? Who are the people involved? All of us are involved. I think the government itself that has paid lip service to this when we had a lot of resources to really develop our agricultural base did not do so. And we did not realize the fact that developing agricultural base where you have over 60% of the populace operating will create a new group of people who pay taxes, who are better educated, have access to the wealth of the nation. This did not happen. We also have the local government that really does not exist, and the state governments themselves. Now, where we are going now has already started, because I am privileged in the sense that I'm able to move around wearing two different hats. The first hat is that of the Red Cross, because of this situation we're finding amongst the people. And we discovered that a lot of people in the low-income areas are saying, I would prefer to die by coronavirus than by hunger. I'm not interested in your coronavirus. It takes a longer time for coronavirus to kill than hunger. Those are the realities that are faced meeting these people. And I feel that Nigeria now needs to completely retool and reset itself. And this involves everybody. The financial sector that has only paid lip service to agriculture over the past 30 to 40 years will now need to really wake up and restructure itself for what will make Nigeria a sustainable economy. As it stands now, we have burnt our fingers, and I think it's time for us to realize the danger of what we have done wrong in the past. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. We'll touch on some of those pertinent issues you mentioned as the conversation continues. Nkemdilim, I'd like to get your perspective, because you are within the IT space, and this is going to be a really important part, firstly, to reach people, and secondly, in finding solutions on the ground. So, Nkem, if you could join in, give us your sense right now, and I think the question on leadership and how your world has changed is still very relevant. Are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Eleni.
Sorry, I don't know why I didn't see you. prolonged my question. There we go. Go for it.
Okay. So I think that COVID-19 has, sort of put us into a situation that is like a diagnostic tool where we're seeing all the gaps. We're seeing the gaps in, our economic focus. We're seeing the gaps in healthcare, and we're seeing the gaps in technology. And yes, a lot of businesses have, sort of positioned themselves for a time like this, but they're still seeing that they're not able to really service their customers. And there are a lot more businesses that have not actually positioned themselves and who are now scrambling to find solutions. And what I've realized is that there really has to be a rethinking of your business strategy, and technology has to become the core driver of that business strategy. And it has to, really be the main focus of everything that you do in the future. And I think for that, you need leadership that actually understands technology, and you need to have board members that understand technology. So I think this is really the time where you have to drive digital skill development across your leadership, as well as, all the way down in your organization. When you're driving this, sorry, this is the scenario that was described where a 4-year-old comes in and thinks that this is the time to be the star.
We'd love to meet him or her.
So I think, it's really to think about how do you retool your workforce? How do you also rethink the local talent gap? What we're seeing now is that big organizations have to put in IT freezes because they can't bring in vendors from abroad anymore. They can't bring in vendors from abroad anymore, and they really have to look at local capacity. And if we don't all together build that local capacity and build the local talent pipeline and build human capital, then we will have really, really many issues in the future. So I think this is really the time for collaboration, for the public and the private sector to work together with the technology sector to build that capacity, to build out the technology tools and infrastructure that is required to really take us ahead and also allow us to be a competitive nation in the very near future.
Thank you, Nkem. That's fantastic. Boye, I think this is a great point for you to pick up on. Local capacity, manufacturing, being able to produce our own goods, whether it's ventilators, whether it's Q-tips, or whatever it might be in the value chain of healthcare or even essential goods and services. It's a really important time to have this conversation. And I keep asking the question, we couldn't do it during the good times. Can we do it during crisis mode? So you tell us, sir, how you get this right.
First of all, good morning, everybody, and thanks, thanks for the invite to this. And as everyone has said, it's tough times for everybody and unprecedented times across the space. I'll come to your question last, but I'll just take a view of where we are now, what we're doing now, and then ultimately touch on, as we come to the discussion, we'll see that we'll touch on everybody else's points, because the transformation journey is what will lead us to answer the question you're talking about, because of where manufacturing is. As of today, obviously our biggest task or our biggest challenge today is to ensure that we manage what our stakeholders need. And as of now, food is still an essential component of what is required in the country, and we're classed as an essential service. So within the pandemic, we have had to keep producing to be able to get food across to the citizens of the country. That production process has had to go on, bearing in mind what's going on as well, because we have a duty of care to our staff. We have a duty of care to ensure that they're not exposed unnecessarily to hazards whilst we still get production going. We've also had to deal with distribution and logistics in a tough time where, states are closing borders and things are happening that are disrupting that entire supply chain. There's been a lot of collaboration, as Solape has said, with government, which has allowed passage of some of those trucks. And we've had to work extensively with government to actually ensure that that supply chain is not disrupted. So to date, we've been, with support from government especially, been able to get transportation, to get our production staff into the company to ensure that we're still producing a relatively large sum of goods to send out, and being able to distribute that to ensure that at least food as an essential component is delivered into the hands of people. We've also had to play a strong role from a pure corporate point of view in terms of corporate social responsibility. We've participated in the coalition against COVID by donating a significant sum of money. We've also we've donated food, and we've brought in medical equipment. So those are things that we're doing in the immediacy to ensure that at least for now, there are palliatives for people and that the supply chain is ensured. Now, on the other side is moving into the future. This has highlighted a lot of transformational issues that we in the manufacturing sector have not dealt with and will have to deal with going forward. If ever there was a burning platform that has occurred, this is it for us. Now, the good thing that has come out of it is there's been effectively a lot more collaboration, between us and government, for instance, and potentially now between us and financial institutions on an electronic platform for payments, because we're finding that cash is even more difficult to move in this time frame. And more importantly, we're also noticing that with supply chains being effectively difficult across the world, we have to start producing a lot more locally. Comes back to backward integration that Mr. Ijewere was talking about, and down to manufacturing that you're talking about in terms of being able to, today, we've got quite a number of our fellow manufacturers now producing face masks. That's the first step. But obviously that's not where it has to end. This highlights the need for us to be in a position to produce a lot more than that. But I think, as I said, we've seen a lot of collaboration, a lot of people now seeing that transformation is important in our sector amongst other sectors. And I think that this is a good starting point. Maybe a few years later than it should have been, but I think we're where we need to be now. And I think there's a good chance of us doing better moving into the future.
I mean, I'm going to kick off now the dialogue, starting with what you'd mentioned about supply chains. And that's the most important thing, is keeping supply chains robust and open. And when you've got countries closing borders, and by the way, in the context of the continent being talking about the Continental Free Trade Area, it was meant to go live mid this year. Things have changed so dramatically. You're saying that you're fortunate that you're able to keep your supply chain strong. Are you concerned in any way that might change? And what would it take to make sure that it doesn't turn into a scenario where you can't get essential goods and services to people in a country as large as Nigeria?
Well, to date, it has worked because I said we've got collaboration in particular from the federal government and from the Nigerian Governors Forum, as well as state governments who have ensured that they've provided safe passage for goods and services. The more security issues build up, the harder it becomes for us to get through, because states then begin to lock down even more. More importantly as well, you start getting issues where, from an agricultural perspective, if we start disrupting the supply chain of agricultural products, then that supply chain of raw materials that we also use to produce would become even more difficult. And that disruption is just going to come from lockdowns, meaning farmers don't get to their farm sites, or they don't get things like fertilizers and certain other products to them. That's the fear. As I said, there's been good collaboration today, but that's also going to be difficult to sustain unless we also sustain the ability for food to reach people, because that's what leads to all forms of social unrest that will disrupt that chain.
Well, Mr. Ijewere, let's bring you in here. On the agricultural side, I was reading an article about the UN saying that the world is going to face huge food shortages because of the lockdown, because of the pandemic. And you were alluding to something we've even heard here in South Africa, rather die from the coronavirus rather than die of starvation. Are you concerned about food security, and what is it going to take? What kind of leadership structures is it going to take to ensure that that does not happen?
What really needs to be done, and I'm glad that Boye referred to the trans-border transactions. Boye, are you aware of the fact that a number of companies who carry goods across borders have appointed consultants to negotiate from local government to local government? That was an issue we have just recently discussed. This part of the system that we need to understand that while in Europe and developed parts of the world, their biggest war is against the coronavirus. in the mentality, in Nigeria, the upper class main problem is coronavirus. The lower level people are not interested in coronavirus. It's so remote from them. So what's happening here is that I think going forward, we need to have a complete paradigm shift in our mentality. Government must need to understand that food is more important to the people.
Sorry, I just want you to say, if you don't mind, Mr. Ijewere, are you in agreement that we should be under lockdown to buy us time? Or do you think that we should focus on other issues rather than locking things down and telling people to embark on social distancing when in many scenarios on the continent it's not a possibility?
That's what I was driving at. Locking down itself should not be one system fits it all. Yeah. In a lot of places where they are remote from the possibility of infections, and many of these people are in the hinterland, in the villages themselves, they should be allowed to go back to work, because if the lockdown is total and complete, even farmers, a number of people who are supposed to ensure the implementation will ensure that even the farmers don't go to their farms. We've had that, for example, in Kaltungo, we had a message yesterday of a riot of some farmers against the enforcers. And these are the issues that I'm saying that there has to be a paradigm shift at all levels at government. When government says that food is an essential commodity, they don't just say it. There must be a complete commitment to it. As at now, lockdown for sake of the pandemic is fine, but it should not be done across the board. That's the point I'm making. We have a situation now, we are going to face a big problem from October, November, because the farmers themselves are not getting the inputs they need, the fertilizers, the seeds they need. They don't have it now. The rains are just coming in now. Government needs to first of all understand this, and they should permeate right through. Even the task force that has been put in place needs to understand this, not just make statements about let us shut down. I support the idea of shutting down to prevent further infections, but I think the food is just as important. And with those of us who normally sit down and discuss amongst ourselves, fall within that group of people who see the pandemic as the priority right now. I see it as a priority right now. But going forward, let's not forget those who are unable to be with us on this platform.
So I'd like to go to Solape, because I know that in Lagos State in particular, we're talking food parcels, we're talking about working with food vendors that are supplying essential goods and first responders, for example, and keeping that industry alive. Give me a sense of how food is a priority during lockdown. And I think everyone needs to answer this question for me. Are you in agreement that there should be a lockdown? If we could start with that, Solape.
Okay, great. So I think this situation is probably the greatest tightrope performance for anyone. We're all walking in a very uncertain scenario where you could err on either side and it's disaster. So everyone is learning. No one in the world knows how to do this well. A few weeks ago, everyone was sure Sweden was going on the wrong track, but it turns out it works for them. So for me, the answer is whatever you need to do, it comes back to discipline. And I said that earlier. Whatever you need to do must work for you, and the people must be willing to cooperate and work with you. If we do a shutdown and no one is actually shutting down, then it's completely pointless. If we say wear masks and no one is wearing masks, then it's pointless. If we say go about your business and no one is doing, so it really, people just have to work with whatever the strategy is for it to work. Otherwise, it's just a strategy. So if a lockdown, the point for us in Lagos, the value of the lockdown was 1, to slow the spread, which it actually did. 2, to give us time to put in place infrastructure, which we needed to do, and we have been able to ramp up and do that. We've gone from 28 beds to 110 beds because we started preparing early. So by February, we were at 110 beds, isolation center beds, and now we're approaching 500 and looking to get to 1,000 and more. So that has given us some time to do that. But it has helped us, but at some point, as everyone has said, the economic considerations, there's the hunger virus that everyone's talking about. They want get out and about to earn money. And we have tried to address that by providing the food packs to the most vulnerable. Of course, if we say there are 10 to 15,000 million poor people in Lagos, we cannot provide for everyone. But it's been great to have the private sector support us in that. We're very socially close-knit culture of people. And so it's unlikely anyone will go completely hungry. Somebody somewhere will have pity on you and give you food, but it's still a really untenable situation that cannot go on forever. And there are beginning to be security risks as people get restless and mischievous. So there are real concerns. So the idea is we don't want to keep everyone just locked in the house forever. At some point, we will have to go out, and there's a plan in place for how that will happen based on the data that we see. But in response to the question on how we've tried to intervene, we've provided food in conjunction with our private sector partners for at least, we provided for 1.2 million people, 200,000 households. The private sector has complemented us to almost double that, giving that those dry food packs that could last for 2 weeks to the poorest of the poor, the indigent, those in prisons, motherless babies' homes, the elderly who are identified, home-to-home deliveries, as well as community distributions, working with associations, artisans groups, and so on. We found that that wasn't even always sufficient. There are a lot of people who can't even cook, who don't have anywhere to cook. So last week, we started a cooked food initiative, which has actually been really successful. And the way we did that also had to be creative. We thought at first, okay, let's just cook food and give to them. But what we found typically worked was identifying people in their communities who typically provided food to these lower income people in normal times, who had themselves then been economically stunted because they had to shut in. What we did was let them come back out and cook for the community that they cook for. They already know these people get food from them every day. And what we have seen is when we have adopted that, and we have about 350 points across the state and more to onboard, it has been orderly and people have been more satisfied. It seems a lot of people are actually happier with the cooked food, even though I guess it depends on what category you fall into. So those are some of the interventions that we've tried to do. We intend to also do some cash transfers at some point. And we're really just trying to see whatever it is that we, whatever point of intervention we can meet people at, just to make sure that they're well taken care of. But I have to reiterate Mr. Ijewere's point. Agriculture and food security has always been a big point for us, particularly since the advent of this administration, and it's something we're working towards. Lagos in particular is not really food secure in that we import a lot of our food. And what this scenario has shown us is if those borders get closed, or if farmers in other countries and other states stop planting, which they should be doing at this point, we will indeed run into a problem. So we are already talking to farmers to make sure that they can start planting now when they're supposed to, so that there's no problem further down the line.
I just want to say, it's 15 million people in Lagos that are on the poverty line that are hungry right now.
Well, so between 10 and 15 million people at or close to the poverty line, and those numbers could go either way depending on the outcome of.
Thanks for that. Alex, the reality is governments across the continent do not have the money to throw at this problem. Around the world, everyone is throwing money at this problem. Stimulus packages, we're talking multi-trillion-dollar packages, even just in the United States. African finance ministers have said the continent needs $100 billion. It pales in comparison to everyone else. But even so, there's no fiscal room, there's no fiscal space to be able to raise that money. We're going to need debt relief, we're going to need to go to financial institutions, we're going to have to get loans, and we're going to have to pay it back. So this is the point where the private sector needs to dig deep and assist. So what do you think the role of the private sector is going to be? And I'm not just saying normal CSR projects. I'm talking about CSR becoming part of the DNA of companies across the board.
Thanks for that, Eleni. And I do have to sit on a lot of the points my colleagues have made. No government could have prepared for this, even the developed economies. We've seen the United States put out 10% of its GDP to support its economy, and even that is not enough. So how much is enough is a good question, but I don't think we know. I think for as long as we are going through a pandemic that, as of today, has no vaccine, so no true defense, what we can do is rely on rapid testing and social distancing to create a first layer of defense, so to speak. And also dealing with the current situations with the African countries who are, we're largely, we provide to the world commodities largely, right? Okay, there's very little industrialization. manufacturing that goes on. So if we can't go out and do that, either at agriculture or oil, then there's a big problem. I don't think as an industry we've ever felt as insignificant in the world as of now. I think we've always sat on the the notion that the world is largely configured for oil. I think the world is largely configured for what humans decide to do. Right now, we've decided to stay home to deal with the virus, and oil is next to almost irrelevant to most people. We're sitting here having this conversation today with probably the littlest amount of consumption of oil. I mean, of course, we have data, we have internet, we need the telcos to operate, and all of that. So, but none of us are moving around or traveling or in cars or having to go to our offices, etc. So, there you go. There's a mental shift that has happened. You asked a very direct question. How does private sector step in? My earlier point, I focused on long-term solutions. There's a short-term impact that we need to deal with, which is getting goods and essential services across countries, Nigeria included. But there's also the long-term conversation as to how do we come out at the end of this? Private sector, for me, needs to step in and start to prefer some of those solutions. We've seen in our own case what we've done. Just speaking to Solape's point about feeding and hunger, we've pivoted into looking at the entire value chain and saying, okay, right, how do we get food and essential materials to the lower sector of the economy, of the social ladder, of the social class? We set up a platform called the Aggregator Platform, which looks at pulling together all the NGOs, because let's not forget, right? NGOs and this support structure has existed before COVID. What we need to do now is enhance the work they do. We've pulled them together and we're working with a group of NGOs looking to extend their capacity and reach other communities which haven't been reached. And the idea of the Aggregator Platform is to coordinate the efforts. And I think that's what's missing. I think we spoke about that earlier on. I think Boye made a point about that, and Mr. Ijewere as well spoke about the coordination is key. You can ask people to shut down, but how do you get people to do things that move the economy forward in this time? Now, that platform, for example, allows significant of donors to come on board and decide what areas they want to fund, what local government they want to help, and basically open up the entire need space for us to close that gap. And we've been in talk to Lagos State government, which is our starting point, and then we'll move to the other states in the country. So that for me is one of the sustainable things that private sector have to do. That's on the social side. Now, just on the operational side, we as oil and gas producers have to work with the government to look at our capex and our opex budgets. The government has pivoted to that, and they're vehemently pushing for us to reduce this budget significantly. Now, what that does is it takes off the burden immediately from the top line, which has reduced significantly. Governments are earning less. We have to spend less on developing oil reserves. It is true today that we need more money to fight COVID and sustain our economy than to drill wells or do other capital projects, and we understand that. But we must not forget something. After COVID, there will be a demand. So we must always think past the pandemic and all the issues.
Alex, you mentioned, it really stuck out to me when you said, you're in an insignificant industry right now. And, yes, you're seeing demand destruction globally because of the lockdown, but you're right, it's got to return. Demand will return at some point in time. But I'm just curious, when a company sees 60 to 70% of its equity being wiped off, and you've got loan repayments, and you've got, there are so many things that you've got to think about, and you've got salaries to pay. What do you do firstly to protect jobs? Because that needs bold leadership to say, you know what, I'm going to, get into my balance sheet. I've got to draw down my cash reserves. And yes, shareholders are not going to get salaries now because frankly, they've got big enough bank accounts. So how do I protect jobs, and how do I still protect the business to weather the storm? I'm going to be a smaller version of myself perhaps after this. And it's not only oil and gas companies, by the way. So many businesses and leaders are dealing with the same thing. It's like, what do? Do you pay your staff or don't you? Here in South Africa, our president has asked businesses to still pay their staff and their suppliers so that we can just keep the economy going. What do you do as a leader? How do you make that decision?
Eleni, I think the first port of call with regards to anything to do with cost cutting has to be with capex, things that are procured, that are bought, an activity that drives additional capacity. We don't need the additional capacity, and I think that's the point. We may need it later on in time, but we can invest in those we can invest in that agenda later on. The conversations between banks and all your capital providers must happen. The government has provided the palliatives for the banks, and that is being transferred on to a lot of the companies. So that must happen. I think those are the first places you look at to attack for cuts. We at Oando have kept staff working and in their jobs and paying them. We've been digitized for a while. I think if this lockdown happened 3 years ago, we would have been able to operate comfortably. The company has invested significantly in a robust IT infrastructure. Currently, we have a cloud ERP that supports us and has supported us before now. So for us, it's seamless. However, but not all companies are able to operate in this fashion. What's critical is that for as long as you can justify the work that's being done, we will keep our staff on and we will pay them their salaries. The important thing is, how do we ensure the large ticket items are reduced to the bare minimum? The operating framework of the company will shrink, no doubt. And, there might be some rationalization around other expenditure to do with, other sort of comforts around, the company itself. But these are conversations that we certainly are having and are making significant progress on. I want to touch on something very quickly. Whilst the pandemic goes on and we adjust for the global destruction that's happened to demand, one of the things that the government is doing, aside from the palliatives and supporting in the OPEX and CAPEX program, is they're looking at accelerating some of the key, at least industry enabling projects. So we have 3 key projects, the ELPS, which is the Escravos-Lagos pipeline. We have the OBOB pipeline and the AKK pipeline. These are 3 projects that are looking to make significant progress to completion by the end of 2020 or 2021. Now, the NNPC are focused on getting these to a stage where when all of this is over, we are a country that is not only ready to be more efficient when it comes to oil and gas exploration and utilization, but also domestic capacity increases, and then we're able to have more barrels for export. The point being, we must also prepare for the future and not just sort of maintain this focus on the current destruction. And for me, that's our style of leadership. It's looking ahead and what can we do at the moment to ensure we come out strong on the other side, but certainly keeping the company alive between now and hopefully when we find a cure for coronavirus.
Thanks, Alex. Ini, get you in here. So you've got an interesting role as a financial institution. Firstly, we talk about, engaging and distributing social grants or money. Banks can definitely help because you've got the back-end technical support to be able to do that. Can you help? And then secondly, just to Alex's point, I'm curious, how many businesses have knocked on your door and asked for debt restructuring or loan guarantees? What is it looking like now? And are you worried about defaults in this environment? And how do you support these small businesses that just don't have money to weather the storm?
Thanks. If I take the latter question first, clearly at times like this, given the shocks that have been created to the macro environment on such an unprecedented scale, it is to be expected because the impacts on an economy like ours are twofold. One, you have the natural business slowdown on account of all of this, and then you also have the secondary effects of devaluation, which inevitably tends to happen on account of the low oil prices, less FX revenues to the government, and so on. So it then portends that the credit environment is likely to be a lot weaker. Now, we are engaging with those businesses, and I think again, the regulator, to the central bank and the Ministry of Finance, have stepped in quite boldly to provide a fair degree of forbearance that ultimately will be passed on to some of the customers. Now, forbearance comes in giving us that flexibility to restructure. Because when you look at some of these businesses, the core underlying business still makes sense. The environmental factors we face today on account of the lockdowns have stunted cash flows, have disrupted supply chains and all of that. And we do see that at some point, the country will reopen and things start. So again, with engagement with the customers, as Alex mentioned, this is the time for the corporates, the SMEs, to engage with their bankers. And then we will find ways to look at the exposure, look at ways to restructure so that we can match off some of those cash flows and see how we can provide support at this time. That's traditionally what your bank should do, and where we are seeing that at this point. To your first question around distribution of cash transfers and all of that, again, the evolution of financial services in the country, I think one area where the Nigerian financial services sector has really developed is in terms of digital penetration. And if you look at where we've gone in the course of probably the last 10 years, and especially in the last 5 years, we've moved significantly. And most banks, especially a bank like ours, has extended our digital reach quite significantly. So when we speak about distribution, and this is where we are engaged with government at both the federal and national levels, where we put and made available that platform to get that last mile. I spoke earlier about our agent banking network. Today, we've got 55,000 agents all over the country. They're in 772 local governments. The only two we're not present in are where we have security challenges around Boko Haram and all that. And these are platforms that are available to get you that last mile, to actually get the cash into the hands of the consumer. And in the reverse, what we're even finding out, we even use that on the other bit, because speaking earlier, we talked about what are the disruptions affecting businesses, right? At the B2B level, the financial services sector or industry, the infrastructure is robust enough for BAU to continue. So I'm sure any of the panelists here in Oando or Flourmills is still able to transact, open their LCs at that level. The challenge is when you move to B2C, especially last mile. And that's what we're all faced with today. So fine, yes, the trucks are going out, distributing food all over the country. How are you getting the sales back? How are we collecting the cash with market activity? And it's the digital solutions that we have that are allowing that, and also driving change of behavior. And that's what we're seeing today, where it is those agents, not even the bank branches, because most of our bank branches today, on account of what is going on, are closed. So it's using those platforms, the agents, and all of that. They're collecting as well as paying, effectively driving that intermediation at that micro level. And I think that is an area that working with the government and other relevant agencies, we need to explore and expand, especially at times like this. Thanks.
Thank you, Nkem, give me your sense on how technology and ICT can help. We've seen it being utilized in so many different ways. What is your prognosis on how it can be further used to get to people, as Ini was talking about, the last mile? That's going to be vital. It's the most vulnerable.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think that it's really about looking at the problems that you're facing, right? Whether the problems are in your supply chain or in education or in healthcare, and really looking at what kind of solutions can you build around that. So telemedicine is one of the areas that has now been heavily deployed for example, pregnant women in Nigeria who are not able to go to the hospitals to get healthcare. And I think that we're going to see these models sort of continue and also deepen as we go along, and sort of create a lot of value for our economies and our societies. Education is another big issue. So now the private schools are homeschooling, but what are the what options do the public schools have? The public schools really don't have any options at the moment. So they're using radio and TV to deliver education. But is that really sustainable? That's really one-way communication, and you don't have a way of actually engaging and interacting with the students. So I think that we're going to see education heavily leverage e-learning systems, but obviously in order for that, all of this, whether it's telemedicine or e-learning to really function, we need infrastructure. So I am hoping that this is also a wake-up call for the government to heavily invest into infrastructure development and also look at the policies that surround those, to making that happen. The reason why we have a lot of issues with last mile infrastructure development in Nigeria is because of double taxation, right of way issues, and other issues that, just the cost is just astronomical for private sector providers to actually lay this infrastructure and be able to get to the last mile. So a lot of the time, government has policies in place that are not necessarily enabling. So I think it's really what has to happen is that we need to go back to the drawing board. We need to ask ourselves, how do we enable technology as a nation? How do we digitally transform as a nation? How do we make technology the driver of our economy? Whether we're using technology in agriculture, or we're using technology in oil and gas, or we're using it in healthcare, or we're using it in education, it must become the core of everything. Now, in order for it to become the core of everything, apart from infrastructure, you need human capital. And we really, really lack human capital in the technology space. So I think that we also have to rethink our digital skills pipeline, and really rethink our human capital pipeline in the technology space in order to really think about how do we retool people, how do we make sure that people can interact with technology and use technology to add value to our economy, especially if working from home is going to become something that more and more companies and people adapt. It means that without the right technology tools and without the right technology skills, we will not be able to, sort of keep the economy going. So I think we just really have to sort of create strategies around technology, and we have to do this in collaboration with the public sector and the private sector. I don't think that any of the sectors can really do this alone, because there will always be stumbling blocks. And I think we need to just, sort of use design thinking and remove all of the friction that we see in all of these different areas, whether it is policies or it's infrastructure or it's human capital, and really address those head on, make tough calls to invest in those areas heavily, and hopefully see results in the next 5 years or so.
You know what, I feel like I've had this conversation so many times before, because these are the things that we should have been doing anyway along the way, and I just feel like it's taken a pandemic for us to finally act, and I wonder what that's going to mean for us, like the new world after this. And now we've got less resources than what we've ever had, and we've got so much pressure on businesses, more than what we've ever seen. And I'm just going through everyone's questions, and if I could just kindly ask everyone to just ask a short, sharp question for me to be able to get through as many as possible. I've been reading through some of the comments, and thank you very much for engaging so much. You can see I'm like sneaking in some comments while we're engaging in the panel discussion. A big thing that we spoke about that people have responded to is job sustainability and job retention might be more important than CSR, because if you can maintain jobs in this environment, then people still have an income and can buy food and so forth. So that was a really interesting comment. Food security has come up a few times, again, in the last mile. How do we reach those people? And then support for SMEs and smaller businesses, and ensuring even the farmers are going to have the resources that they'll need to make sure that they plant during the planting season, just like Mr. Ijewere was talking about earlier. So if I could just get Mr. Ijewere to just touch on what farmers are telling you right now, what they need, how do we support them, and what you're expecting from government to do. What leadership does government need to take in this department, or do you think it's the role of the private sector?
Fortunately, we have one known government official here, that's Solape. I would say that the government of Lagos State has been exemplary in its interaction with farmers. But what should government be doing, not necessarily Lagos State, is the fact that we recognize that Nigerian farmers, who are mainly peasants, produce over 130% of the food we need to eat in Nigeria. But over 60% of this food is either lost in the farm, in transportation, in the markets, and so on. Now, that brings us to a situation where food insecurity comes to the fore. Lagos State is one of the most food insecure in the country, but they are very efficient. And I'm not too worried about Lagos because they have a way around every problem. They have very good people working in Lagos State. But many other states that are marginal have a lot of challenges in terms of food security. The food security situation, the first tackle we need to deal with is that all the players, including the bankers and so on, let's talk about reducing the post-harvest losses. Work on those, support those people who are involved in reducing this. Solar power is available, but investment is high and it's long-term. The other one is the transportation system. The roads are not very good. The railway system needs to be improved. It cannot be done overnight, but let us all join hands together to give priority to these. If Nigerian Railway can spend, in fact, more time providing for cargo carrying wagons, that would be very great. Nigeria's structure as a country, most of the food is produced in the north. The south does not have as much land as the north. And therefore, recognizing this means cooperation between all the various governments and all the various private sector organizations. Even amongst the farming community, amongst the agricultural community, they need to come together and work as groups, as cooperatives, as clusters, and everyone needs to work with each other because they have all worked in the past in silos. These have been very detrimental to Nigeria's agricultural growth. But we have all the potentials. Going forward from what we have learned, I believe, and listening to all the panelists here, I'm quite excited about their mindset and the direction we are going. Nigeria we're going to have is going to be different, but it calls for cooperation from all parties.
I'm going to go
I thank.
So I'm going to go to some of the Roshni Gajara mentioned that we spoke about human capital. What plans are there around reviewing labor policies to adapt the current regulations to the alternative ways of working that are making the new normal, leveraging technology, saving costs, sustaining business in that way, and finding a purpose for employees? The whole system needs to be lifted into the fourth area reality. Who wants to tackle that?
I'm happy to look at that. Recent research by UNESCO shows there's 1.6 billion kids that have been affected by this stay-at-home lockdown. Of that, 870 odd million have no access to a computer. Another 700 million of the same subset have no access to the internet. We can't speak about human capital without education, right? So, like the human capital conversation, but I think the first conversation to have is, are we ready? What I think coronavirus has done is track the industrial revolution, the next revolution, which is the digital revolution. We have today school systems and curriculums that frankly are out of date and wouldn't prepare anyone for the future ahead of us. So we start there. I think retooling and retraining professionals to adapt to new technologies and ways of working, I think that's a much easier job, and private sector typically leads that conversation. But there's a conversation around what sort of what sort of ingredients are we feeding into these kids? What are we teaching them, and what are we arming them with from a fundamental perspective? And I think that's the first place to start. And I'll let my other colleagues chip in.
Yeah, just to go into some of the other questions on e-learning, for example, there's a comment about how EU and the US is able to embark on e-learning, but the reality is in the most remote of areas, anywhere on the continent, how do you equip kids with iPads and all sorts of other, technology that would be able to result in an efficient and sustainable e-learning environment?
I'd love to take a stab at that. So in September, at the beginning of in January this year, actually, we started to adopt the use of the technology-enabled learning in our primary schools. Working with a company that's done it in quite a few states in Nigeria. So what we did was put technology in the hands of the teachers, and then the children use workbooks, because it's still a challenge putting technology in the hands of all the children. We have probably 1 million or more children in school, and it's very expensive to put that in their hands. So we put technology in the hands of the teachers. But what has happened now is we have millions of children at home. So we have to explore that. It's a little bit more challenging, and First Bank has actually supported. They've provided 20,000 tablets for the children in SS3, so thank you, First Bank. And some other partners are talking about doing that. But in SS3 alone, we have 50,000 children. And you can imagine trying to put 1 million pads in the hands of children. We're looking at about $125 million, $1.25 billion just to put the tablets in their hands. So it's something we have to think about creatively, and we're thinking we go the route of radio and television as well as the tablets, because even when you put the tablets in their hands, they're going to need somewhere to charge it. Sometimes it's even a security risk for the children, because in the neighborhoods that they're at, people can take those things from them. So it has to be thought through very carefully, but without a doubt, there has to be some form of digital or remote learning put in place, because it's unlikely we're going to get into schools for a few months to come. And so we have to then think about things around community centers and workbooks and places where they can go to, maybe in fives or one-on-one. This is somewhere where we can leverage volunteers, for example, to support the process, who can mentor these children and help the ones who aren't doing as well. Because you're right, it's important that we can track their performance, and you can't really do that if it's only a one-way communication system. But I think a combination of digital learning, workbooks, community centers, and working with mentors and volunteers to sort of support that entire system will need to be put in place. There was a call with with the private sector and public sector education practitioners with the ministry just this week, and we're looking at some of those solutions, including a unified curriculum of sorts, something that can be put out and at least get our children through this period of time.
Thank you for that. Boye, I'd like to ask you this question from Taiwo Adeniyi, and basically talking about the value chain and harvesting issues, where another member in the audience mentioned that they've seen trucks of tomatoes go bad because of no storage facilities available. And this question, it's really long, but I'm going to read the last sentence. Government should fund or support by way of policies to provide refrigerated trucks for transportation of farm products. What's your thinking about this? Because you understand the value chain scenario in Nigeria quite well, but I'm going to go back to Mr. Ijewere's point, where the reality is roads, railways all need to be prioritized if you're going to get goods moving from the north of the country to other parts.
Yeah, thanks, Ali. Before I answer that question, I'll quickly answer something on technology and then come back to this. One thing that I'd like us to look at from a technology point of view, which has been highlighted by the pandemic, by the way, is we do need to focus on getting a national identity card system, because one of the things this pandemic has shown is we have failed to be able to do direct transfers in a proper way, which would have assisted us immensely. And that would help tremendously on the back of the BVN that we've got.
Yeah, and that national identity card was actually on the, being discussed for many years.
Yep. But I'll come back to the value chain question. Absolutely right. The there's a need for a rail network to work, and there's a need for road infrastructure to work, or else a lot of the crops we produce will have issues that you've highlighted with things like tomato. What today has been happening is we have had to take processing plants as much as possible or as close as possible to where farming occurs. Not necessarily the most efficient way for them to run, but that's the only way we're able to deal with that value chain and stop goods from perishing. Trains are going to take a while to fix. What would have been nice for us to do as a country would have been, whilst we were getting the new standard gauge system, to have somehow kept the narrow gauge going so that at least there was some form of transportation for those goods and services. The ideal solution in terms of looking at refrigerated solutions, we keep looking at. The key issue there is to make sure we do not put additional costs on top of the products that are then transferred to the consumer. So as one of the things Mr. Ijewere mentioned was solar power. You're getting more and more solar powered refrigerated solutions that are reducing that cost of that. And as that comes into play, then they will be used more. But ultimately, the value chain today is largely built around moving processing plants or processing facilities as close as possible to where where farming occurs. Not necessarily the most efficient, but at this stage, the easiest way for us to deal with it.
Interesting. Okay. Lots of questions, guys. I'm just trying to get through all of them. The one question keeps coming up about e-learning and teachers. One of the audience members was talking about how teachers and lecturers are going to be without jobs in this environment. And the other question is that you have an education system that was already far below many other countries. And now you're trying to take it a step forward by adding the e-learning element to it. Is it actually going to work? I also thought that question was quite interesting. The other question was on diversification, and they're saying, well, how do you diversify when you don't have power supply? That again is something we've reiterated through the years. So how do we solve that problem? I'd like for you to tackle that, panelists, if that's okay. And then if we could just talk on the issue on identity cards. One of the panelists says that, well, one of the audience members says that the ID card scenario is actually not going to work because you need a really strong system to be able to deploy those. So how do you actually do that in this environment? You need to find other ways. These are some of the comments we're seeing from audience members. Again, the big topic that's coming through, guys, is job retention. And if you all could just speak to that, how do you, I mean, the realities of businesses on the ground is that, well, I can't pay my employees, so how do I survive this time? There are so many issues facing us right now, and I think if you could just tackle some of these, I'm going to start, if that's okay, with Eleni, and then move down the line as we start getting more comments from the audience members. I'm pretty overwhelmed by all the questions. It's incredible to see all the comments, by the way. So thank you. But Eleni, go for it. Okay, thanks,
Eleni. If I'm just, let me start with the comments around the ID card system. I mean, fundamentally, we don't have one, a unified one, and we've got different pockets of biometric data all over the place. But I think we're never going to get a quick fix to that, and largely because we've never really focused on addressing it holistically, because we distribute national revenues based on demographic factors, so it's difficult. But that said, if you look at the BVN platform, today we've got about 41 million BVNs, right? Which means there are 41 million individual unique individuals in the financial services ecosystem, which is tied to a bank account and money. So that represents a decent platform for distribution, because behind that, within the financial services sector, there's enough analytical power in there to define who are the individuals behind these BVNs. And it then represents a basis to use for such distributions or these cash transfers or whatever. Again, the financial services industry, led by the central bank, has been driving financial inclusion, which is looking at empowering and engaging that bottom of the pyramid those people that are not captured, those people that really need this empowerment, bringing them into the financial services sector. And I think if resources are deployed around that in a concerted way, we can expand that base. And then that becomes, and then on the other hand, government then needs to centralize all of that. Because if you look at what happens in India and how the Indian government distributes directly to the poor, cash transfers to its population, it's essentially doing that and doing it through the financial services sector. So I believe there are enough building blocks in place that we need to work on to start, rather than expecting to have one national identity card system that will come in overnight. There are a number of initiatives around that. The central bank promoted SANEF. Some of the banks individually have agent banking networks like we do that are enrolling people onto the BVM platform. And it really is that bottom of the pyramid in the places that we physically are not, where we don't have the bank branches. It's in those far-flung local governments and communities, and they're signing them up. And it is a secure platform. So I think that's a start. I think we should focus on enhancing what we have and getting there. On another comment which speaks to job security, I agree, it is key. But at a time like this, given what we're facing on account of the COVID and all of that, the challenges the country faces, and we've all alluded to that, with the gaps that we have in the basic social infrastructure and amenities that we should have put in place, whether it's education, whether it is the failing of the healthcare system, power we can talk about for forever, really. Just the gaps are so huge that direct interventions, whether you call it through CSR or whatever, are required. And that is why if you look at what COVID has done in terms of raising funding for direct interventions around supporting healthcare, if you look at, and even in Lagos State, a lot of the support in increasing the capacity around the isolation centers, medicals, and so on, has come from direct interventions by the private sector. Because these things are just so glaring. And as has been agreed, largely globally, the whole essence of the lockdown is just to give us time to develop or to prepare the health sector to deal with the issues. So they are needed. The longer term solutions for around job security lie with getting government to align more with the private sector in terms of policy formulation, policy stability, and taking long-term views around investments in critical sectors of the economy. And that's work that still needs to be done. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much, Ini. I would like to now go to Nkem. It's so funny, through these last few weeks, I'm almost hearing the conversation moving more towards aid, NGOs, people assisting CSR projects. It's funny because before that, we were talking about, becoming a lot more independent, building strong businesses. And again, we've just moved the goalposts only because we've really had to. Could you speak to that as well, and what your thoughts are as a captain of industry?
So I'm very, I don't know, I would say we have to be very careful when we talk about aid and, sort of backtracking and increasing those dependencies. I think we should really sit down and explore all different models that, have maybe worked in other countries or models that are new. I think that we really have to, sort of be very, very creative and innovative and identify the key areas that we need to tackle. And I think in all of it, whether it's a CSR initiative, it has to be something that is long-term sustainable. Because what I've seen a lot is that a lot of the initiatives are very short-sighted and and they're not necessarily sustainable in terms of how do you sustainably fund these initiatives. So I think we need to really, bring all our expertise together. People from the financial sector that know how to create financial models need to come and sit with development agencies, need to come and sit with government, need to come and sit with people in technology to really brainstorm models that can work and models that will allow us to sort of have as little dependency as possible. And I do believe that this is possible if we really put our heads together and if we, all double down and, focus on the development of our nation as opposed to necessarily focusing on our own individual bottom lines and benefits that we may get out of certain projects or programs. So, I think this is the time where we all need to wear patriotic hats, and we all need to contribute, and we all need to problem solve, and we all need to collaborate. And, we have to stop pointing fingers in terms of, oh, the government did this or this person did that. No, everybody is together in this, and we have to all work together. And I'm hoping that we're going to see some of that.
Okay, so here's a question from Sunday Nwachukwu, and the question is, to what extent are we likely to see a genuine realignment of the budget allocations to the reality of the demands for infrastructure, educational, healthcare needs, and so forth? It's quite long, so I'm just trying to cut it down. And all other key factors required for assurance of desired economic survival and growth. Resources allocation based on corruption of leadership, if not radically addressed at this stage, will not permit effective transformational needs in Africa. Who would like to tackle that? Because let me tell you, the question of corruption and within leadership on the continent, and frankly around the world, it's not just an African problem. It's like now we're trusting government to spend money when we need it most, when their track record has been corrupt activities. And by the way, I'm looking inwards as well because we have that problem here. So who would like to tackle that? Alex, I see that you unmuted yourself. Go for it.
No, I mean, I was, Ini made, great points. And I just want to sit on top of a few of those. He spoke about BVN. He spoke about, the linkages that can be done. They have great modeling teams and they can pull all of this data together. I want to take us back to how China was more effective than most in dealing with COVID. It had a network of data points that it leveraged upon to drive the level of contact tracing and isolation that was required to curtail the virus. Now, at a time like this, I can't point fingers at any because we together with the NNPC and other oil producers also have donated to the federal government to address the COVID issue. But isn't there a construct that says, let us pull the data points we have together, BVN, your TIN numbers, whatever it is, all the data points together, pull that data into some sort of unified database and have our brightest minds work on that so we can determine how best to leverage on direct transfer. Look, I understand the social side, and the truth is with the government and the social contribution, the can is still wide because the development has been stalled for very long. So when we talk about corruption, if we had developed the system as rapidly as we should have as a nation, the issues of corruption today will be dealing with in much different ways. Governments would not be able to move money around without, the private sector or the citizens being able to see where that money is going, understand what its use is. And someone made the point about, budget allocation. A 10 trillion budget, of which close to 3 trillion is recurring expenditure, it is a large government. I mean, if we look at that.
If you're wiping off, a significant part of your revenue from, the fall in the oil price, and then you're also looking at your foreign exchange earnings completely decimated, that brings down the ability for you to spend even more. And it really does bring a concern about the ability of the Nigerian government to spend effectively now.
I think when we speak about effective spending, we must understand that at this time, effective spending is to cure one of two things: the number of COVID-related deaths or the number of COVID infection deaths. That's all we can focus on. When you speak about effective spending, I don't see the government having the capacity to inject the necessary funds to build infrastructure, to enhance the educational sector in the short term. Now, we hope the recovery is sooner, but again, to one of my colleagues' earlier point, a significant amount of our foreign exchange and indeed GDP is from oil, which is depressed at the moment. So economic development from an infrastructure build perspective, for me, is a conversation that needs to be delayed slightly. There are things you can do in the interim to shore up your position so that when you get the revenue, you can embark on that. But for now, we need to feed Nigerians. Number one risk factor in sub-Saharan Africa is social unrest due to hunger, not the virus itself. Yeah. There is no better time to make sure your constituents, your people understand that you value them and you value their lives. Mr. Ijewere spoke about movement. I mean, all sectors face this. I mean, we have issues around COVID where we have transshipments that require quarantine periods, and all of this delay builds into that inefficiency within the supply chain. Governments must understand this and one, deal with those delays by improving those processes, and private sector is always there to help them, and we have. But more importantly, understand the effective spending you speak to today is for survival. Solape spoke about a lot of the work Lagos State is doing, and you can't do that without the finances, and the country simply doesn't have the finances. And with private sector support, we would do more, but the truth is there's still a gap.
Okay, so one of the questions that also came up that was interesting, which I was going to ask as we ended off the conversation, and let's tackle that now. It's, what do you think your business and your world is going to look like post-COVID-19? And just keeping in mind that we're still on the cusp of it really playing out across the continent, not only in Nigeria. So we don't really know what that's going to look like. I mean, the best case scenarios, people talk about that you have a young population, so hopefully we'll be somewhat protected. And then the worst case scenarios then fall in the place of, well, you've got healthcare deficits. So that is a very big fear. And business needs to be preparing for that. What are you guys placing in terms of your modeling and your scenario planning about what that's going to look like? And I'd like to start off with Eleni, and then move down the line on this question, please.
We see a radically different future for financial services. I mean, when we look at the business today, effectively, we've got between 70 and 75% of our staff working from home. Even if the lockdown were to be lifted tomorrow, we certainly are not going to have those people come straight back into the office. So ways of working, ways of engaging rapidly shift and change. How does that play out into financial services? Clearly, engagements with customers, especially at the retail interaction level, becomes increasingly more virtual and digital. The whole debate around the role of the bank branch, the brick and mortar in favor of the digital channel, the platforms we need to deploy, how we change the face of the service industry, right, to more of a lifestyle industry changes. The new sectors we'll have to look at because, again, we're seeing existing business models change. In the face of all of this. So these are real fundamental changes that we expect to continue and drive future investment, future ways of engaging, future ways of analyzing businesses and looking at them as we deploy financial services to them. So it's a big thing we see, big differences in that way. Thanks.
Thank you, Eleni. Solape, I know that you're more, you work with government, and I am curious to find out what it's been like for you to work firstly with government institutions, and then also just tackling the question on what you think Lagos State, your job, your ability to work with government is going to look like after the pandemic is over. If you could just unmute yourself. There we go.
As you pointed out, my work with my sojourn into government is pretty new. I worked in private sector prior to that, so I think I still have a little bit of balance in terms of perspectives. But with regards to where I think this in Lagos State, well, my job is to attract investment into the state. And like a few people who've spoken here today, I believe that in everything there's an opportunity, even in a terrible situation like this. And what's important is for us to prepare, preparation meets opportunity. It's the same thing that happened to us in terms of calling out the situation even as early as January and getting ready and starting to make our own preparations. And when everybody saw that, they actually got on board and supported. And we need to do the same thing. We need to, I love the conversation we've been hearing on identity. Again, that's something Lagos got ahead of early. We set up our residency agency to basically something called the Lazarus card to get everyone registered when as a nation we were still having challenges with getting the national programs going. And today we're working with the country. So NIMC has appointed Lazarus as one of their first partners to do the national card registrations across the state. So unifying those two databases helps us to grow really quickly. And we're doing all the things everyone said here. So looking at the banking sector databases, looking at the mobile company databases, looking at the electricity company databases, looking at the things in our social register, people known to the NGOs that are working out there, anything we can do to identify the socially vulnerable. So just wanted to make that point on identity. It's really key. And without that, you cannot plan and you cannot act. So we need that data. But for me, my job is attracting investment into Lagos, as I had said. And so it's important to reach out and make those connections. In times like this, there's always a flight to safety. And while that looks like maybe flight of capital away from the continent, what it invariably means is even when there's interest in the continent, it will typically come to places like Lagos, which are known to be resilient and to some extent commercially viable. So it's important that we position ourselves properly so that our businesses and work with the private sector. Again, I keep saying that because it's extremely important. Work with the private sector in the sectors that we think can grow, and therefore we can reskill people and move them into it. We're talking agriculture, we're talking technology, e-commerce is going to get a boom, telemedicine and healthcare generally, even to some extent, the garment industry, PPE textiles, we're starting to advocate the use of masks. I'm not wearing mine today, but I should.
Where's this going to come from when you say, attracting investment? And I get these are exciting industries, but globally there's a flight to safety. Where do you see this coming from? Do you think it's going to be stimulus package by the Nigerian government? How do you see it playing out?
So for us, I think it's going to come from the private sector. And I think it's going to come from international organizations. We've been getting on calls with some. They do realize that there's a need to support. And while the whole world needs support, you do have to support. And looking at Nigeria in particular, that's, got the highest population on the continent, and Lagos has got 10% of that population in this little dense space that we call. It's very important for capital to come here. Otherwise, we risk unrest across the rest of the world. And we do have some interest coming in, and it's important that we capitalize on that.
That's very good. Mr. Ijewere, you've mentioned really important points for us and food security, not forgetting the farmers. And I think that really resonated with me. And I wonder what their life is going to look like as the curve of infections increase. And
requires a percentage of security.
Well, I didn't quite get that last part.
Sorry, I can hear something else happening for some reason. Yes, I can hear people speaking somewhere. Okay, let me try again. So, what is the life going to look like for the farmers, for the agricultural sector, as the infection rates start to increase in Nigeria? And what do you think their life is going to look like post this? What is your prognosis on this?
My looking into that future, into that, I believe that as far as the agricultural space is concerned right now, farmers in particular, all they need right now is the encouragement, because they're beginning to realize that they're becoming more and more important.
Yeah.
Looking from a global point of view and the kind of future Nigeria should face is that Africa has about over 60% of the arable land left on this planet. So we're going to end up as in Africa to feed the rest of the world. But we have big problems, and we have some solutions that got created. We have a very, very young population. Unfortunately, that population has not been geared towards agriculture. The government and its system and the level of corruption has encouraged them to think of faster way of getting money rather than through hard work. That psychology needs to be put in place. The other thing is that we who are privileged to have an opportunity of talking to those in governance must stop using political correctness to talk about corruption. Corruption is corruption. A situation where government has drastically reduced its budget, but the members of the National Assembly are collecting that are not reduced, 37 million naira per month. Why, if we start talking to each other and pretend that everything is fine, we are creating a situation where the dissatisfaction will continue and might roll up into being a crisis in terms of security and so on. It's already started right now. And Lagos State has more than 10% of the population in Nigeria. As far as food is concerned, I would say Lagos State consumes almost 18 to 20% of the food in Nigeria. And I believe that Lagos State, with all the efficiency they have, I will want them to add to their theme. They have a policy which is called theme, THA. You have transport, health, and so on. Agriculture, food is not included. And I think that's an anomaly. I will ask Solape to bring this to government. Thirdly, we have the situation where the level of yield of our produce is so low. And that's because those who are educated, who have access to knowledge, who can go onto the internet to get information on how these are done, are not in the agricultural space. More and more of these people should start coming into it and be encouraged to come into agriculture. Then we can now start having changes. So going forward, I see a bright future. I see a learning curve, but I see a new and changed Nigeria. That change could come through violence or through constructive thinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Boye, your thoughts?
Thank you. Well, a post-COVID world, whenever that occurs, which might still be a while away, as you alluded to, I think a lot of the things, from our point of view, we play across the entire food value chain. So a lot of what Mr. Ijewere says on the agricultural side is relevant to us. We think big thing would be government cannot use its own fiscal muscle or cannot use purely its cash balance to get itself out of this. It's going to have to work in partnership with the private sector. And that partnership means we will now be focused on policies and policy aims that will drive industrialization, ensuring that we can create a sustainable environment for manufacturing to occur. And two, a good working relationship on ensuring supply chain works. We were talking earlier about food processing, the ability for us to ensure products are within easy range of whether it's silos or processing plants or semi-processing plants to ensure that we don't waste products anymore. From our perspective on the worker side, we think that obviously the dynamics of what has happened has meant that worker education is going to become even more prevalent, but also in terms of products, as a desire to invest a significant amount more in research and development to get to a type of product component that can serve a market whose consuming power or consumptive power ability is going to be reduced.
Thank you so much, Boye. Alex, post-COVID world. Are we going to be a former, sort of a shadow of our former selves, do you think, in the business world? Or are we going to prove that, yes, as Africans, we are resilient, and that's what makes us, get through any kind of crisis, no matter what you throw at us?
I think we're probably the most resilient group of people on the planet. Dare I say, we've struggled through interesting leadership structures over our existence, and we're still here. We're still thriving. So I want to touch on something very quickly. Chalakwe made a point about acting quickly, and I think Lagos State did. The interesting thing about COVID, it's not a respecter of actions in silos, right? Okay, so Lagos State may have done the right thing, but then the rest of the country itself, if it's at variance, then we don't see the level of effectiveness of the actions that have been taken by Lagos State. And if anything, you may see a watering down of those actions, right? So the facts are the facts. We had our day one, and up to today, we've seen cases go up to about 800 and something cases. We anticipate that over the next couple of weeks, based on some internal reviews we have done with a team of modelers within our organization, that number would grow significantly. Now, when we speak about post-COVID, the question is how long is COVID going to last for? Because I think any government, time is the one thing that is the unknown here, right? We don't know how big our balance sheets are. Our Federal Reserve stands at about 36, 37 billion. So we all know what we have. The question is how long can we string that for? And if we can't answer that question fundamentally, I say a post-COVID outlook is one that says we have stripped ourselves down to the truth. Only the essentials are being looked at. Some of my panelists spoke about policies that are focused on industrialization. At that point in time, it will be the only way to go. They say you expose anything to the sun, it's a natural disinfectant. I think COVID, in a sense, has become natural disinfectant for us as a people, our minds, that mental shift that we needed to make. It's interesting that all of a sudden, all of us can work from home.
Yeah.
So we don't need to all fly to Abuja for 5-minute meetings and 10-minute meetings. That mind shift is what is critical. And I think we're seeing it across the value chain. There are pains today, and I don't want to belittle those or not address their significance, but we would work together to do what we can to address those pains. I do urge all of you to check out tap2reachall.org. It is a way that we can feed the entire Nigeria, and we start with Lagos State. We are pushing funds down to people who are doing this work already. We're not reinventing the wheel, they're doing the work already, and the idea is that they can expand their capacity and reach the forgotten ones. Tap2reachall.org. Post-COVID, I think, yes, I think post-COVID, oil and gas would also be significant, but not as significant as pre-COVID. I think we will see a focus on renewables, the heavy dependency on oil, and this flux that we've been in has created a little bit more insight as to how we could function as a world, not just Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, with less dependency on oil. And I think we will see a shift in the mind. I think the mind is the first thing that needs to shift first, okay? If that shifts, then all the other actions follow. And lastly, as a company, we intend to be in business. We intend to support our staff and our partners to ensure that we make it to the other side, and we continue business as it were. We know we will be smaller, we will be potentially more agile, and hopefully Eni would cut us some slack so we could build before they come collect their money.
So Nkem, if you could just add your thoughts, and then I'm going to go to one last question, which we've received, and then we're going to start wrapping up. So Nkem, could you give us a post-COVID world ideals, how you think it's going to work?
Okay, so I think post-COVID, there'll still be a lot of restrictions in place. I think there'll still be a lot of these travel bans, and especially industries that have a lot of physical touch, like the makeup industry, physiotherapy industry, and other industries like that will still struggle. And I think we have to rethink sort of a lot of different things. And I think this, new low touch economy where touch becomes something that can infect. We have to rethink our business models. We have to rethink customer interaction, whether we're a bank or whether we're a massage salon, right? We really have to start thinking about how do we interact with customers. So I think that we'll see a lot of new customer experience models that will be tested out. I think that a lot of companies will leverage technology. And I think that we will hopefully also learn from this and invest in the key areas, being education, healthcare, our infrastructure, and obviously retooling our government, our private sector, and ensuring that we have the human capital that can actually create value, for us as a nation, because we cannot really continue to rely on the old ways that worked in the past. So I'm hoping that, we're going to see, real changes, and I hope that it will not just all be talk, because in Nigeria, especially, we like to talk a lot and we like to come up with plans and never implement these plans. So I'm really hoping that, a lot of the things that have been said on this panel today and a lot of the, sort of insights that we've gotten can be used to create strategic economic plans that will actually get us out of this and get us into a permanent situation of prosperity, and create many, many more jobs and create real value that we can then also export to the rest of the world.
So the other important question that I was even asked, by the way, yesterday, whether we'll see protest action and major insecurity in Nigeria because of the crash in the oil price. But I think it's interconnected with what we've been seeing in the lockdown, and some of the questions that have come through in the last few minutes is about insecurity in Lagos, food insecurity. And I think, Solape, if you could speak to this, what are you seeing on the ground, and is it a concern for you that Lagos could be a starting point of what Mr. Ijewere had warned on, the violence, or we could do this in a way of wisdom? I mean, which road are we going to pick here, and how do we as leaders make sure that we don't go down the wrong path?
Thank you. So of course, we are always concerned when there's any hint of insecurity. Again, this population, massive population, and you don't want anyone to feel unsafe. Particularly if we're asking people to stay in their homes, they need to be sure that they're safe at home. As I said, I think there are obviously different categories of people. There are people who are restless, there are people who are mischievous, and there are people who have outright nefarious intentions. And it's important to be able to address the flashpoint of a couple of weeks ago when the people were hungry or said they were hungry. And I think a lot of that actually had to do with communication. I think some people thought everybody in Lagos was going to receive food, and so they didn't receive food, and then it became a source of unrest. But when the clarification was made that it's food for a particular category of vulnerable people, as well as efforts made to reach them as well, I think that sort of died down a little bit. We do have some mischief from, some cults, little cults of pockets of cults from here and there, but there's been intensified security. So the federal government actually, the Inspector General of Police deployed an additional Deputy Inspector General of Police and 4 Assistant Inspector Generals of Police and several teams of mobile policemen to the state last week, Tuesday. And we've seen a very much slowdown in the spate of violent activities. So I don't think Lagos is likely to become a flashpoint for activity, and definitely not because people are hungry. And what we need to do is address the security concerns that exist in every large city in the world. I mean, there's 25, 26 million people here. It's impossible that we will not have 1 or 2 people who are mischievous. That happens every day, everywhere. And then things like addressing, making sure places, the street lighting, and the police teams moving around, and the emergency numbers work. When people started to find that those numbers worked and the police came, things started to die down a little bit. So we will continue to respond to those things as quickly as we can, because when you nip them in the bud, they're addressed.
Okay. Thank you to all my panelists. We are running out of time. I want you to very quickly, in just a couple of phrases, tell me how you're feeling right now, whether you're feeling optimistic, and what your main message is to Nigerians and Africans alike. Mr. Ijewere, I'd like to start with you, sir. Microphone. There we go.
Yes, can you hear me now? Yes.
Perfect.
What I would say is that First, I start from the known to the unknown. I was in my farm yesterday, and I saw the kind of positive vibes of a number of my own farmers and a number of people around. And I saw a situation where people in Lagos State are all back to agriculture because Lagos State was efficient in providing the movement document. That is positive. However, we have a number of people in the country who believe that they are hopeless. Solape is right that there are a number of miscreants who are taking advantage of the situation, but we are moving into a position where those miscreants will no longer be dominant. Hunger will translate good, honest, and hardworking people into to appear like miscreants. We've got to be very careful about that. The population of the hunger is very large. Like I said, for example, immediately after this, now I'm moving on to Makoko, and we're wearing the other cap of the Red Cross. We are feeding them in Makoko today. That's the Red Cross. I've just got phone calls coming in during this to say that the people are already assembling for a 3 o'clock feeding session. These are people who are very hardworking, but low-income people. I'm just simply saying that we should not use a general way to cover everybody. Hunger would translate you from being a decent person to be a very bad person. That is what I'm actually saying. Lagos State has done very well, and I'm very, very glad about this. But Solape, Lagos State consumes almost 20% of the food in Nigeria. Therefore, you must take agriculture and food more seriously in Lagos. You have one of the most efficient governments in the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Boye, just a couple of phrases, please.
Okay, for me, I'd go apprehensive and upbeat. Apprehensive. Well, this is difficult. You know, in reality, this is a no one knows the end of. So you're apprehensive because of that. But upbeat because when you look at the way people have come together, the coalition against COVID, the amount of, the effort they've put in, the isolation centers that we've set up in across the country in no time, the efforts of people like Red Cross, other associations, it has created a sense of community, a sense of people trying to do something to make it work. So that's the balance I've got.
Thank you, Boye. And Kim?
So I think I'm actually very optimistic. And I think the reason for it is because this is, to me, a real wake-up call for us as a nation. And I think that everybody, needs to really, really use this as an opportunity as opposed to using this as a challenge, and making sure that, we really think about how can we use this as a springboard or almost like a catapult. It pulls you all the way back just to really sort of elevate you and catapult you forward. So I really, really think that, for me, very optimistic, and I'm looking forward to sort of seeing where this will take us in the next, 2 years or so. And I'm hoping it will be right at the front.
Can we importantly meet your senior advisor?
Sure.
Hi. Let me tell you, I admire all women and men sitting at home with children right now. Hello, how are you?
Very busy, as you can see.
This is, behold, the new generation of leaders.
Definitely.
So much, Kim. Ini?
I'm optimistic. I believe mankind has faced these kind of things at different stages of our evolution, and we will beat this. We will find a vaccine or cure, but it will take time. I think, it's important that it's happened now, and it gives us an opportunity to step back and hopefully take a hard introspective look at ourselves as a nation, and perhaps start to take and deal with some of these failings of the past. Our needs are immense, and quite frankly, this has laid bare the gaps almost everywhere in different parts of our society. what is clear is that government cannot do this on its own. And I hope that this clearly puts that in the face of government, where they understand that their role is to be an enabler to provide, to allow for the flow of capital from private sector international sources to help us address our needs. But I think it's important, and I think it's great that we've come together as a people to deal with this. And I think we should glean all the positives from that as a nation as we move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Eleni. And Alex.
I'll make mine very short and straight to the point. Look, the hardest thing is the decision to act.
Yeah.
COVID has taken care of that for us. The rest is merely tenacity. I mean, I look at Solape and the energy in Mr. Ijewere and Ini and, Boye's great mind. For me, we can only succeed. The decision to act was the issue. And I think COVID has given us that opportunity. I never thought I would ever call COVID an opportunity. Thank you very much, everyone.
Alex, thank you very much. Thank you to all my panelists. What a pleasure and honor to be with you today. Thank you so much to the audience as well. We have one more very important speaker, and one of the organizations that made this happen is the Institute of Directors Nigeria. We have the Director General and the CEO of the IoD Nigeria, Dele Alimi, joining us now. Sir, I know you've been listening in. You're going to wrap up the session for us, give us some of your thoughts, and perhaps, how you're coping and what you think the post-COVID world is going to look like.
Thank you very much, Eleni. It's been a wonderful morning, going now to the afternoon. And I must say a big thank you to everybody that has made this possible. Whether we like it or not, we have seen the gaps in our systems. We've been forced to see it. Whether we've seen it before and we've been lying about it, or we've been pretending not to notice it, now it's been brought to fore, and it's right there in our faces. One thing I've now found out is that whether we like it or not, every global economy is going to come out of this at the same rate and at the same time. And Nigeria has to decide how it wants to come out of it, because this is affecting everybody. Nobody is going to be there to help you lift you up. So you really have to lift yourself, and that's where all hands must be on deck to get us out of the effect of COVID. So much has been said, and I'll try as much as possible to keep this as simple as possible. The issue of food and security seems to have taken center stage at this moment, and we've kind of seen the importance of those two almost neglected part of us in the scheme of things. We're on lockdown, and what has become more important to everybody now is food and security, because without it, things will not go well. So getting out of this pandemic, I hope we've learned our lessons, and I hope we're not going to go back to status quo. Yes, somebody in the panel said we are very resilient people. Yes, but the disadvantage of this resilience is that we find out that every time we have this kind of issue, we end up becoming complacent after it's over, because we think, oh, we always get around it. So there's a need for us to now know that we can't go back to it being business as usual. I want to thank everybody. I want to say a very big thank you to the entire panelists, and of course to the participants. We were able to keep you for 2 hours, and we kept your attention. I thank you all. I thank Oando. I thank IoD Nigeria for making this possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Alimi. I appreciate your time. Thank you to all my incredible panelists. Thank you for engaging and being open and honest. I wish you all, the audience and my panelists, to stay safe. And thank you very much for leading us during times of crisis.
Eleni, I give you this.
Thank you so much, sir. Usually I get a clap from the audience. I can't hear anyone, but thank you, Mr. And a big round of applause to you as well. Then. Everyone is clapping in their homes or offices. Thank you.
Well done.
God bless.
Thank you.
That's my last report. That's the actual.